Well, class, here we are back again. I'm glad that you all were able to join me for this lesson. And this one is going to be a lot of interesting history that we have actually touched on some of these, but we haven't actually gotten into the more interesting details in the last few lessons. So this is where we're going to get to talk about some of those more interesting details. This is the Revolution and a New Nation. So, the American Revolution. How this came to be is this first part of it here. Now you remember that we have colonists here on our part of the world, ruled by England, way on the other side of the ocean, which, remember, at that time, even though it's not fast now, but if you were going to take a ship across the ocean, because they didn't have airplanes, obviously, it would take months. So this was a long way away. England was a long way away from the American colonies. But they were still ruling them. They didn't, a lot of the, most of those citizens of England had no idea, other than maybe some stories in the newspaper or fiction books set in that setting, of what the American colonists had to deal with. So they didn't really understand. And the English people were seeing everything from their own point of view. So they didn't have any voices from the American colonists to tell them what is really important over here, or what is going to be needed, or what is acceptable. Any of those things. The colonists had no voice at all in England, and England didn't understand them. So there was a lot of things that were going on that were causing the colonists to be upset with how things were being handled. Some of these things were acts that were set up in England to generate money for England from their colony over here in the Americas. So one of these was called the Sugar Act, and then you see the Stamp Act, and then the Tea Act. So all of these were ways to get money from the colonists. Sugar, stamp, I think that was like a tax on imports, exports, things like that, and tea. That was, of course, imported to the colonies, too. So all of these were things that the colonists had to pay. They didn't have any choice, and they didn't have anybody to talk to England about why that was not a good idea, or how much they should have to pay, or anything like that. So they were just told they had to pay it. Of course, the colonists didn't like that. It didn't work for them at all. And one of the main things that you're going to hear in history is called the Boston Tea Party. Now, this is a play on words. This is for fun. It's called that. That it could have been called something else, but this is one that is stuck because it was fun. And you'll think about commercials nowadays. They'll make up fun names for products. They'll make up funny ads, things like that stick in people's minds. Well, this one stuck in the Americas' minds for the name of what happened when the colonists got upset. So as you probably know, a tea party, people sit around a little table. They have tea poured in their cups. They have little cookies or something like that to eat, and they talk to each other. Okay, well, this is not what that was. Boston had a shipload of tea come into its harbor from England. And now tea was the main drink back then. They didn't really have coffee. So they had tea for every, thing that they drank other than maybe alcohol or water or something. But the Boston people, colonists, decided they were not going to put up with it. They were going to make a show that England would notice about how upset they were about having to pay a tea act tax on the tea that they got, which they felt like was a necessity, really. They really wanted that tea because that's what they drank all the time. But they decided to go steal onto the ship, steal all of the tea out of the hold of the ship, and dump it in the harbor. So they had created tea in the harbor, so that's why they call it a tea party. Okay, well, that definitely got England's attention. England responded with what has then become called the Intolerable Acts. Intolerable means you're not going to put up with it. So Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was closed until the colonists paid for the tea. So Boston Harbor was a big place for where incoming products from, well, every place, but primarily England, of course, came to the colonies. And with it closed, they had a lot of their needs and wishes were cut off, so they wouldn't have them. And England decided they were going to close it until the colonists paid for all the tea that they dumped in the harbor. Also, they had sent soldiers from England over to the colonies to enforce that, because they knew just saying it that wasn't going to get anywhere. So they had to send soldiers over there. They didn't have places to house their soldiers when they got over here. So the soldiers had to live in whatever buildings were already here. So they had to live with the colonists, or the colonists had to clear out buildings that they were using for other purposes and give it to the soldiers. And they had to also pay to feed them and anything else that they needed. And the colonists, of course, were not very happy with that, but that was their response to the Boston Tea Party. So, at this point now, the colonists decided that they were going to have a group of their leaders meet together and come up with some kind of solutions. And that was in 1774. They called this group the First Continental Congress. Congress in this case meaning a group of people meeting together for a purpose. So this is the first one, and it's continental, so it means all of the colonies on the continent, and they were meeting together. The First Continental Congress met, and they created a document that said some of these things here. First of all, they're saying they're still loyal to the king, but they have some things that needs to be addressed. So they outlined what the colonists felt were their rights. That's not necessarily what England thought was their rights, but what the colonists thought were their rights. And then the First Continental Congress planned a boycott, which is a refusal to buy products. So they boycotted British goods. So they're saying, okay, and we're not going to buy your goods either. So you're going to be losing out on all that money you would have been making from us buying your stuff. So this is what the First Continental Congress did. When that got back to England, of course, that didn't go over well with England. So neither side here is happy with the other side at all. In April 1775, battles started being fought, and the first ones were at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. And they were the start of the Revolutionary War. After that, of course, came more battles, but since there became more battles after that point, that's why they can determine that that was the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Okay, then later, during the Revolutionary War, the Second Continental Congress met in 1775. Now again, this is just a group of people, the leaders coming together. They voted to create an army so they'd have something to fight back against England with. And they named George Washington as the commander-in-chief of the army. And of course, that was when a lot more battles started being fought, and George Washington being in charge of the army now that we had. The colonists, or the Second Continental Congress, adopted the Declaration of Independence in 1776. So they wrote it up, and everybody agreed to it, and they sent that off to England for them to see that this is where they thought that they should be independent from England. And they had these battles, and the war lasted 5 years. And it ended finally in 1781 in Yorktown, Virginia, which is not too far from here. Some of you may have visited that area as part of your schooling or history, or just as a person that wanted to go traveling around. It's kind of near Williamsburg, and not so far as Richmond, somewhere in between there. And at last they finally won the war, and the Americans gained their independence then during the war. Now this was the first time, now listen to this, this was the first time that a European power of any of them, that is England, France, Spain, those are the big ones that were colonizing the world at that point, had ever lost a colony to an independence movement. So none of the other colonies that had ever been created by any other European power had ever been lost to a revolution. An independence movement was another word for the revolution. Other colonies then fought for independence after that. So we started the ball rolling here, and got a lot of other colonies to fight for their own independence. Okay, so that was the Revolutionary War in a nutshell. Now, the years after the Revolutionary War, we're just talking about 1783 to 1789. So immediately following the Revolutionary War, the nation was in a serious economic depression. So I think we all know what that is, especially right now with the coronavirus. We're in an economic depression right now, and that means there's little money, a lot of people are out of jobs, there's all kinds of economic problems going on at the same time. And at that point, the central government did not have an executive branch or a judicial branch. So executive branch, remember, that's the one that's headed by the president. The judicial branch is the one that is headed by the courts. So the government could not tax to raise funds, so they had a hard time coming up with any money to pay anybody. And the government could not regulate commerce between the states, Remember we talked about last week that the states were all separate and they could tax goods going across the state lines between each state. So the states were pulling in that money of the commerce coming across the lines, but the central government wasn't able to do anything about the commerce between the states. They were totally left out of that procedure. Each state had its own currency and charged its own taxes to raise funds for that state. And we talked about that last week. They not only raised their own money, and that money all went to their own state, but they also had their own currency, so there was nothing like an American dollar bill. You know, they just, whatever state you were in had its own dollars and change and coins and whatever. Now, all of that made it hard to run a government in our country. Well, I guess you could say it's our country, but it's not anything like the country we have nowadays. So that country that we started out with, it was very difficult for anything to get done as a government. So now we have the Constitution coming along. Why do we have the Constitution? Because we needed to change the way that our government was set up. It wasn't working. Like we said in the last screen here, there was a Great Depression and a lot of issues that were not being able to be addressed by the central government, so they couldn't really fix some of those issues. The Constitution represented compromises between the centralized power and the states. Okay, let's look at each part of that sentence there. Compromise. What does a compromise mean? Well, everybody is used to doing these, but they probably don't really think about the word necessarily when they're doing them. But you have children. Say you have two children. One of them wants to have the favorite toy. They want to have the favorite toy to play with right now. The other one wants to have that favorite toy to play with right now. Okay, well, you can't both be the only one playing with that same toy at the same time. One item cannot be in two different places at the same time. So you have to come up with some way for an idea of how to work all this out between the two parties. So that's called a compromise. So as a parent, you might say, okay, this is something you can play with together. So how about if you sit down and play together with it right now? Okay, that would be a compromise. Or you might say, okay, Tommy, you had it first, so let's let you play with it for half an hour. And then, Sally, you can play with it for the next half an hour after that. And that way both of you can play with it soon, just not all at the same time. So that would be another compromise that could have been made. And you can probably think of some other ones, especially if you have kids, that you may have worked out with them so that things could run smoothly between them. This is the same thing here in this statement. The Constitution represented compromises between the centralized power, which was the federal government, which we didn't have a federal government yet at that time, so they're calling it centralized power, and the states. So the states had the separate powers, remember? So it's kind of like saying this is a compromise between the parents and each of the individual children, okay? So the parents being the centralized power and the states are the individual children. All have a problem here they all have to work out so that everybody in the whole family has something working. So they're compromising between what the centralized power and the states can do together and make it all work together. And that's what the Constitution was written for. The central government was given powers to tax, create an army and navy, control foreign trade, make treaties, and control currency. So that's a lot of things that on the previous slide we looked at, most of them they couldn't do. They were listed as things they couldn't do. So they can now tax, so they can get some money coming to the central government to do some of the things they need to do, which would include creating an army and a navy. They have to have money for that. So they get taxes so they can create an army and a navy. They can control federal foreign trade. So anything from the central government, the whole United States, with another country, they are going to be able to control that trade. They can make treaties, that is between the United States and other countries, and they can control the currency in the whole country. So the states would not just have their own currency, it'd be the country would have currency. But this is part of the compromise. The states still had important powers. So all of the powers were not given to the central government. All of the powers were not kept with the states. They were broken up so that this was what is the compromise. The states had some of their still important powers. Now, could enslaved people be counted in population totals? Okay, now that was a big issue that they had to work out. So they came up with a different compromise here, you'll see in a few minutes. But could enslaved people be counted in population totals? So those were mostly in the southern states, remember, where the slaves were used to run the different crops that they had there and work in the fields. The Southerners wanted slaves to be counted. Why? Because that would make their population larger than it would be if they didn't count them. And the amount of population that they have is going to come into play here in a few minutes. We'll see that. So they wanted the slaves to be counted. Even though they didn't give them all the rights of a citizen, they still wanted them to be counted as part of the population. The population doesn't necessarily mean citizen, although normally we think of it that way nowadays because that's the way it is nowadays. But back then it wasn't the same thing. Northerners said if slaves were counted for representation, that is, representation in the new federal government, they should also be counted for taxes. So they're saying, okay, you can count them as far as we're concerned, but you also have to pay taxes comparatively for having that number of population in your state. So your taxes will go up because you're saying you have a higher population. Well, the Southerners just wanted them to be counted for representation. They did not want them to be counted for taxes. So you can see that there's a difference of opinion on how the slaves should be counted and for what things they should be counted for. So this came about to be the 3/5 compromise. Said that only 3/5, 3 out of every 5 slaves would be counted for population. So if you had 5 slaves, we're only going to say you have 3 for the purposes of the population of your state. This gave southern states more power in the House of Representatives. Why? House of Representatives is based on however many people you have as population in your state. Remember that? So if you have a higher population in your state, you have more representatives in the House of Representatives, so you have a bigger voice on what happens. So the 3/5 of the slaves would be counted for population, but only 3/5, not all of them. Okay. So the Constitution also protected slave trade for at least 20 years. And that was another part of the compromise. They could still have slave trade in the South, especially for the next 20 years, so that they can continue their way of life. And the idea was to gradually pull away from having slave trade, but that's not necessarily what happened. But the Constitution did protect the slave trade for the next 20 years. Okay, now we're going to look at the United States starts to expand. All right, so over beside the blue part that says the Atlantic Ocean, you're going to see Appalachian Mountains listed in there. Appalachian Mountains is right on the western end of Virginia, so that touches into Virginia. And everything on the eastern part of the Appalachian Mountains basically was where the colonies started out. That's where most of the population was at the very beginning of our country. Then it started moving west. People started going and taking the trouble to go over the mountains and further west and travel to some of the other states to start colonizing them or setting up their homesteads. You can see the end of the Indiana Territory was a big territory. It didn't end up being that big for the state of Indiana, but that was the territory there. And everything on the eastern side of the Mississippi was where all of the first part of the westward movement stopped. The Mississippi River cuts the country from all the way from the top to the bottom, and it is this huge river, which was very difficult for the early settlers to cross. So it took them a long while to get that figured out and so they could carry their property and their cattle and all of their family members and to go past that. So at the beginning, it's kind of stopped there. But then you can also see in the green part on the right side of the map, it says Spanish territory down at the bottom there. So right around the Gulf of Mexico, which is part of the blue water, Spanish territory, which is now mostly Florida. You will probably recognize that in the map there. And so that was also started to get colonized. Then the next thing we see is the brown part, the Louisiana Purchase. Now you can see this is a huge area of the North American continent. And we'll talk about a little bit later how that came to be part of the United States. But at the beginning it wasn't. It was not part of the United States. It was just part of North America. It was not owned by England either. It was owned by, I believe it was the French then. And then you also see a little bit further over to going toward the left is Spanish territory. Again, big letter Spanish territory. And that was primarily what we would think of as Texas and over into California. And then up at the very top in the green is the Oregon Territory. So that was probably the last part that was colonized, although I'm not sure if it was colonized after all of the California part of the country or not, but it's somewhere in that time frame. As you can see, that's why it's all color coded, so you can see that that's kind of the way that the land went. Now at the top in the pink was British territory. Now if you think about it, you probably already know that that's actually now called Canada. So Canada was part of the British territory until just in the middle 1900s. So I think it was 1970 something, anyhow, when they broke away from Britain. But this is how the United States started expanding out.